Alison Baden-Clay. On the night of April 19, 2012, a 43-year-old mother of three was killed at her family home at 300 Brookfield Road, Brookfield, a western suburb of Brisbane. Her husband reported her missing at 7:15 the next morning, telling police she had gone for an early morning walk and never returned. Police immediately noticed 3 distinct scratches on his right cheek. 10 days later, her body was found 13 kilometers away, and the scratches on his face would become some of the most debated forensic evidence in Australian legal history. Alison June Baden-Clay, born July 1, 1968 in Corinda, Queensland, was a former flight center executive, a university graduate who spoke 6 languages, and a former Miss Brisbane 1993. She was a devoted mother to her 3 daughters, Hannah, Sarah, and Ella. She suffered from depression and was on Zoloft. In October 2011, she learned of her husband Gerard's affair with colleague Tony McHugh, and the couple entered marriage counseling. Alison believed the affair had ended. It had not. Gerard Robert Baden-Clay, born September 9, 1970, in Bournemouth, England, was the great-grandson of Scouts founder Lord Baden-Powell. He ran a struggling Century 21 real estate franchise in Brookfield. His debts exceeded $500,000 following the 2010 to 2011 Brisbane floods. Alison's life was insured for approximately $975,000, and Gerard contacted the insurer the day after her body was found, before formal identification, to begin a claim. Beyond McHugh, he maintained affairs with other women and trolled for encounters on Adult Friend Finder under the alias Bruce Overland. Secret emails from April 2012 showed he had promised McHugh he would separate from Alison by July 1st. On April 30th, canoeist Professor Daryl Joyce discovered Alison's body on the bank of Colo Creek, Anstead, under the Colo Creek Bridge. Her jumper was inside out and pulled up over her head as though she had been dragged. Advanced decomposition meant the cause of death could not be determined. Neighbors reported hearing screams, a loud thud, and car tires screeching on the night of April 19th. Mobile phone records showed Gerard's phone was placed on a charger at 1:48 a.m., contradicting his claim of sleeping soundly. The case, led by Detective Superintendent Mark Ainsworth, was entirely circumstantial but powerful. Leaves from 6 plant species found in Alison's hair and clothing all matched species growing around the Baden-Clay home, while only 2 were found at Colo Creek. Alison's blood was detected in the rear of the family SUV. 4 forensic experts testified the facial scratches were consistent with fingernail marks, not shaving cuts. Gerard's shifting explanations, a caterpillar, a broken light bulb, became some of the case's most ridiculed elements. Police actually consulted a caterpillar expert to rule it out. How does a man report his wife missing, hire a criminal defense lawyer that same morning, and visit a high-profile barrister the day her body is found? The trial ran from June 10th to July 15th, 2014, before Justice John Byrne. Gerard took the unusual step of testifying, denying any involvement. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury found him guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a 15-year non-parole period. On December 8, 2015, the Queensland Court of Appeal downgraded the conviction to manslaughter. Public outrage was fierce. Approximately 4,000 people rallied at King George Square, and a petition gathered over 119,000 signatures. The DPP appealed to the High Court of Australia, which on August 31, 2016, unanimously restored the murder conviction. The High Court held the manslaughter hypothesis was at odds with Gerard's own testimony, since he had claimed complete innocence, not an accidental confrontation. Gerard is imprisoned at Woolston Correctional Centre in Wackle, Brisbane. He becomes eligible for parole in 2027. He reportedly still wears his wedding ring in prison and keeps photos of himself and Alison on his cell wall. In 2017, Allison's approximately $1 million estate was awarded to her 3 daughters, not Gerard, the Allison. Baden Clay Foundation was established by her family to support awareness around domestic situations. A Caterpillar defense, a downgraded conviction, and a high court reversal that made Australian legal history. But in the next case, the killer was caught within hours, and the reason was almost impossible to believe. Edward Baldock. On the morning of October 21st, 1989, Brisbane Grammar School rowers found a man's body on the banks of the Brisbane River at Orley Park, West End. He was naked except for his socks. He had been stabbed 27 times. His head was nearly severed. But inside the toe of one of his socks, police found something that would solve the case before lunchtime: a Commonwealth Bank key card belonging to one of the killers. By 10 a.m. that same morning, barely 4 hours after the body was discovered, officers were knocking on the owner's door. Edward Clyde Baldock, born June 9, 1942, was a 47-year-old Brisbane City Council worker and father of 4. He was described as a kind and gentle man with no enemies, someone who kept to himself and looked after his family. He had spent the evening at the Caledonian Club near Kangaroo Point, where he drank heavily over the course of several hours. His blood alcohol level was 0.31 when he was found, more than 6 times the legal driving limit. He was in no condition to defend himself or even to understand what was happening when the 4 women pulled up and offered him a ride. 4 women, led by Tracy Averill Wigginton, 24, had picked up the heavily intoxicated Baldock near Kangaroo Point after he stumbled out of the club. They drove him to the secluded riverbank at West End, where Wigginton attacked him from behind, inflicting 27 stab wounds that nearly severed his head completely from his body. Wigginton, born August 4, 1965, in Rockhampton, stood 183 centimeters tall and weighed 95 kilograms. Abandoned by her mother at age 3, she claimed deeply troubling experiences during childhood at the hands of her grandparents. She became immersed in the occult, claimed to be a vampire, drank animal blood, and frequently wondered aloud what it would feel like to take someone's life. 2 psychiatrists diagnosed her with multiple personality disorder with 4 distinct personalities, including an alter ego called Bobby. One defense theory proposed that an alternate personality deliberately placed the bank card in Baldock's sock to ensure she would be caught, as if one part of her mind wanted to be stopped while another part carried out the act. Her 3 accomplices were lover Lisa Ptashinsky, 24, Kim Jervis, 23, and Tracy Waugh, 23. Ptashinsky and Jervis were present during the attack. Waugh remained in the car. The key card in the toe of his sock remains one of the most extraordinary pieces of evidence in Queensland criminal history. Police traced the card to Wigginton's bank account within minutes. By mid-morning, they were at her residence. After 3 separate interviews, during which she progressed from complete denial to partial admissions to a full and detailed confession, she told officers exactly what had happened on the riverbank the night before. The speed of the investigation was remarkable. A case that could have taken weeks or months was essentially solved over the course of a single morning because of a single plastic card found inside a dead man's shoe. It was one of the fastest homicide investigations in Brisbane's history. Who leaves their own bank card inside the victim's sock? Was it carelessness? Was it a subconscious desire to be caught? Or was it something happening inside her mind that even she could not control? The media dubbed it the lesbian vampire killer case, and it became one of the most sensational trials in Queensland history, drawing international coverage and intense public fascination. Wigginton pleaded guilty to murder on January 21, 1991, and was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum 13 years. Tashinsky was convicted of murder and received life. Jervis was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 18 years, later reduced to 12 on appeal. Waugh was acquitted entirely after the court accepted she had remained in the car during the attack and played no direct role in what happened at the riverbank. Wigginton was released on January 11, 2012, after serving approximately 22 years, subject to 31 separate parole conditions. But her behavior after release raised alarm. In 2019 through 2021, she posted occult imagery on Facebook, including vampires, skulls, and a post reading, "Now panic because I'm back," prompting former investigators to publicly call for her parole to be revoked. As of 2026, no confirmed revocation has been reported. Tashinsky was released in April 2008. A bank card in a sock solved a case in hours. But in the next case, the investigation pointed to 2 repeat offenders who had been cycling through the system for years, and the outcome rewrote Queensland law entirely. Emma Lovell. At approximately 11:30 p.m. on Boxing Day, December 26, 2022, 2 intruders broke into the home of Emma Lovell, 41, and her husband Lee Lovell, 43, at Whitfield Crescent, North Lakes, 45 kilometers north of Brisbane. CCTV from an infrared camera above the front door captured the main offender checking the unlocked door, giving a thumbs-up signal, then pulling an 11.5 centimeter blade knife from his bag. What happened in the next few minutes would reshape juvenile law in Queensland and send a political shockwave through the entire state. Emma Lovell, originally from Hasketon near Ipswich, Suffolk, England, had emigrated to Australia with Lee in 2011. She ran a local ironing service and was described as the glue that held her family together. Lee later said, "She died trying to protect me and our family." They had 2 teenage daughters, Cassie and Scarlett, who were asleep upstairs when the intruders entered. Emma and Lee were woken by their barking dogs. They rushed downstairs to confront the intruders and tried to push them out of the house. A struggle followed on the front lawn. The main offender stabbed Lee twice in the back and kicked him in the face, then stabbed Emma once directly in the heart. Their daughters were woken by the noise. Neighbors heard them screaming, "Someone help my mom!" Paramedics performed open-heart surgery on the front lawn in a desperate attempt to save her. Emma died shortly after arriving at hospital. Both offenders were 17-year-old repeat offenders who cannot be legally named under Queensland law. The primary offender had 84 prior convictions in just 2 years, including 16 unlawful entries, though none had involved direct harm to another person before that night. He had been placed on probation 3 separate times and had never once been ordered to serve a single day in detention. The system had released him every time. The co-offender had 104 prior charges on his record. Both had been released on bail shortly before the attack. The co-offender was released from a watch house on the very evening that Emma was killed. He walked out of custody and within hours was inside someone else's home. How does someone with 84 convictions in 2 years walk free every single time without ever serving a day behind a locked door? The primary offender pleaded guilty to murder on March 11, 2024. On May 13, 2024, Justice Tom Sullivan sentenced him to 14 years detention, the maximum under Queensland juvenile law, with a 70% non-parole period of approximately 9 years, 9 months, classifying the crime as particularly heinous. On August 15, 2025, the Court of Appeal reduced the non-parole component to 60%, approximately 8 years, 4 months, overturning the particularly heinous classification. Lee Lovell was devastated. On December 5, 2025, the High Court of Australia granted special leave to hear the Queensland Attorney General's appeal. The High Court heard arguments on April 11, 2026, and has reserved its decision, which remains pending as of this recording. The co-offender was found not guilty of murder on October 31, 2024, in a judge-only trial, as the court found it could not be proven he saw or knew about the knife before the confrontation began. He was sentenced to 18 months detention for burglary and was released immediately, having already served 2 years in custody while awaiting trial. He walked free the same day the verdict was read. Emma's family watched the second offender leave custody, knowing he would serve no additional time for what happened that night. This case became the single most powerful driving force behind the adult crime, adult time movement that swept Queensland politics. The LNP won the October 2024 Queensland election campaigning on this platform, making it a centerpiece of their law and order agenda. In December 2024, the Chrysler-Fully government passed the Making Queensland Safer Act, introducing mandatory life sentences for juveniles convicted of murder with a minimum 20 years before parole eligibility. Emma Lovell's name is now permanently attached to one of the most significant changes in Queensland juvenile law in a generation of boxing. Day break-in, 84 prior convictions, and a law rewritten because of one family's loss. But in the next case, the person responsible was supposed to be behind bars when it happened, and a warrant that was never acted on cost a 16-year-old girl her life. Larissa Bealby. On approximately June 23, 2018, a 16-year-old girl was killed at a property in Buchan-Logan, south of Brisbane, by her 34-year-old boyfriend. Her body was placed in a blue barrel on the tray of a black ute. 4 days later, when police arrived at the property, investigating her as a missing person, the man fled in the vehicle with the barrel still on the back. A resident at a mobile home park, where the ute was later found abandoned, noticed something protruding from the barrel. It was a human arm. Larissa Levine Bealby, born August 25, 2001, had lost her mother Karen when she was approximately 4 years old. Before Easter 2018, she moved out of her father Peter's home into a halfway house for at-risk teens after fleeing a difficult situation with a previous boyfriend. It was at the halfway house that she met Zlatko Sikorsky. She lied to him about her age. Confiding to friends, she was terrified he would discover how young she really was. A witness named Chantel Maker later testified that Larissa was so frightened she stayed awake for days at a time to protect herself from him. Zlatko Sikorsky, 34, had an extensive criminal record, including robbery, armed robbery, and deprivation of liberty. He had been released on parole after serving less than 2 years of a 5-year sentence and had breached his parole conditions multiple times after release. A warrant for his return to custody was issued on March 15, 2018, 3 full months before Larissa was killed. But he was never apprehended by authorities, despite being a known risk. He was also charged with harming a separate 32-year-old woman just weeks before what happened to Larissa. Had the warrant been executed at any point during those 3 months, Sikorsky would have been in custody, and Larissa would almost certainly still be alive. The system had the information it needed. It simply did not act on it. Forensic pathologist Dr. Diane Little testified at the committal hearing. "I have done over 7,000 autopsies, and I have never seen anything like this." The extent of what Larissa endured was beyond anything the pathologist had encountered in decades of practice. On June 27th, police from the Logan Child Protection Unit visited the Buchan property. Sikorsky fled in the ute with the barrel still loaded on the tray. Police tracked the vehicle to a mobile home park at Stapleton on the northern Gold Coast, where it was found abandoned. Decomposing remains were confirmed inside the barrel. A massive manhunt was launched across southeast Queensland. Sikorsky was located on June 29th at a unit on Juan Street, Alexandra Headland on the Sunshine Coast, approximately 100 kilometers north of where the barrel was found. He had barricaded himself inside the unit with firearms, and a tense standoff began. A 28-hour siege involving up to 40 officers from the Specialist Emergency Response Team ended peacefully at approximately 6:30 p.m. on June 30th, when Sikorsky surrendered. He was taken into custody and charged with murder. The case drew national attention, with the image of the blue barrel on the ute becoming one of the most confronting images in Queensland news coverage that year. But Sikorsky never stood trial. He never faced a jury. He never heard a verdict. On November 10th, 2020, fellow inmate Isaac James Martin struck him in the head at Woolston Correctional Center. Sikorsky died 10 days later, on November 20th, from a traumatic brain injury, aged 37. Martin was sentenced to 11 years imprisonment on May 5, 2023, for unlawful striking causing death, telling others it was karma for what he did to that young kid. Larissa's family was denied the trial, the answers, and the closure they had waited over 2 years for. The man who took her life was himself taken before justice could run its full course. A warrant that was never acted on, a barrel on the back of a ute, and a man who died in custody before he could face a jury. But in the next case, 2 people were locked inside a metal box and pushed into a lagoon while still alive, and the legal proceedings took nearly a decade to resolve. The Logan Toolbox Murders. On January 24, 2016, 2 people were lured to a residential unit in Kingston Logan, south of Brisbane, by a group of associates led by a local dealer named Stu Daniels. A convenience store owner had shown one of the victims a CCTV photo of Daniels, and that was enough to spark paranoia that he was a police informant. What followed over the next several hours was one of the most horrifying acts in Queensland criminal history, and it ended at the bottom of a lagoon. Corey Breton, 28, was a father of a 3-year-old daughter. His partner described him as a loving, friendly, outgoing man who would do anything for the people he cared about. Juliana Triscaru, 31, was a mother of 3 whose family called her kind-hearted and generous. Both were involved in the local trade and were known to Daniels through those circles. Neither of them understood the full extent of the danger they were walking into when they arrived at the Kingston unit that evening. The paranoia that Breton was cooperating with police was based on nothing more than the fact that a shopkeeper had shown him a photograph. That was enough to sentence both of them to death in the eyes of the people waiting inside. Over several hours, the pair were bound with cable ties and duct tape and beaten repeatedly. While the victims suffered inside the unit, some of the offenders drank Jack Daniels whiskey and played PlayStation video games in the same room, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. When Triscaru attempted to escape from the toolbox, Tepuna Mariri sat on the lid and instructed others to close doors and windows. Music was turned up loud to drown out the sounds from inside. The victims were then forced into a 2-meter-long metal toolbox, which was loaded onto a Toyota Hilux. Tuharangi Thomas Tahiyata drove the ute approximately 20 kilometers to Scrubby Creek Lagoon, Kingston. Holes were punched in the toolbox with a claw hammer. It was weighed down with tires and concrete blocks and pushed into the murky water. Both victims were still alive inside the box when it went under. As Justice Peter Davis later stated, "It is haunting to imagine the moment that the toolbox slipped under the water, plunging the night into silence." On February 11th, 2016, 18 days after the 2 victims disappeared, police divers recovered the toolbox from the bottom of Scrubby Creek Lagoon. The discovery confirmed what investigators had feared. 8 people were ultimately charged in connection with the deaths, and the legal proceedings that followed would stretch across nearly a decade, becoming one of the longest and most complex prosecution efforts in Queensland history. If you have made it this far and enjoy deep dives like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss one of these. Gatokuna Mareti, the only woman charged, a mother of 7 who was friends with Triskaru, yet did absolutely nothing to help her, received 9 years. Webstar Latu received 12 years for his role in transporting the toolbox to the lagoon. Tepuna Mariri, the man who sat on the lid when Triskaru tried to escape, pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received 13 years. Tahiata was convicted of murder and sentenced to life with a 30-year non-parole period, making him eligible no earlier than February 2046. His appeal was dismissed in April 2024. Daniels, Thrupp, and Tayao were convicted of murder in March 2021 and sentenced to life. In July 2024, the Court of Appeal set aside their murder convictions and ordered new trials, though their convictions for inflicting harm were upheld. At retrial in 2025, all 3 were found guilty of murder again on June 20th. On June 26, 2025, Justice Glenn Martin imposed mandatory life sentences with 30-year non-parole periods. 9 years of trials, 3 convictions overturned and then restored, and 2 people who spent their final moments locked inside a metal box at the bottom of a lagoon. But the next case has been waiting for answers even longer, over 70 years, and it remains Queensland's oldest unsolved cold case. Betty Shanks. On Friday, September 19, 1952, a 22-year-old woman finished a night lecture at the State Commercial High School in Brisbane City. Her lecturer drove her to a tram stop in Windsor. She boarded a tram to Grange and departed at the Days Road tram terminus at 9:32 p.m., beginning a 400-meter walk to her parents' home on Montpelier Street. She never made it. Within minutes, 7 neighbors heard screams. Every single one of them dismissed the sounds as children playing. Her gold wristwatch stopped at 9:53 p.m., placing her death within a 12-minute window. Her body was found just 150 meters from the tram stop. Betty Thompson Shanks was a University of Queensland graduate and public servant at the Commonwealth Department of Interior. She was well-liked, ambitious, and had her whole life ahead of her. In April 1952, 5 months before her death, she won a half share in a golden casket lottery worth approximately £3,000, roughly 250,000 Australian dollars in today's money. Her name was published in the newspaper as a winner. 2 days before she was killed, she received a distressing phone call at work that visibly upset her. She never told anyone who called or what was said. At 5:35 a.m. on September 20th, off-duty policeman Constable Alex Stewart found her body in a neighbor's front garden at the corner of Thomas and Carberry Streets. Betty had been savagely kicked, beaten, and strangled. Some of her teeth were dislodged, and one had emerged through her cheek. Her face bore traces of black boot polish from heavy kicking, and a patterned mark was imprinted on her forehead from footwear. Her underwear was removed, but there was no evidence of a sexual component. Her handbag and jewelry were not taken, ruling out robbery. If it was not theft, and it was not a random act, then someone targeted Betty Shanks specifically. A declassified ACO file revealed Betty was in an intimate association with a young married man who was a member of the Communist Party of Australia. ACO sent an officer to Brisbane on September 21, 1952, to recruit her as an intelligence source. He arrived only to learn she had been killed 2 days earlier. Over 7 decades, 3 primary suspects have emerged. The strongest theory, championed by author Ted Duzz in his book I Know Who Killed Betty Shanks, points to Eric Sterry, a locksmith who had changed locks at the Shanks home after the lottery win. Sterry's own daughter, Deshi Birtles, publicly claimed her father killed Betty. Sterry kept a photograph of Betty, the only non-family photo in his possession, from 1952 until his death in 1997. RAAF. Records showed he was diagnosed as a potential psychotic who was afraid he might injure someone. In 1960, when 16-year-old Desche ran away from home and police asked why, she told them her father would kill her just like he killed Betty Shanks. Police dismissed her statement. Why? Because Sterry was their locksmith. How does a teenage girl tell police her father is a killer and get ignored because he changes their locks? A second suspect, Dr. Donald Carter, an Ipswich doctor, took his own life 51 hours after Betty's death. He was cleared by DNA testing in 2006. A third suspect, Leonard Petrie Jackson, a married insurance agent linked to Betty, was cleared by DNA testing in 2009. Neither match closed the case. The case remains open and unsolved after 73 years, making it Queensland's oldest cold case. No one has ever been charged, and $50,000 Australian reward remains current. DNA recovered from Betty's clothing has been tested against multiple suspects, but has not yielded a match. Queensland police have reportedly spent at least $55 million in today's terms on the investigation. Ted Duz continues to advocate for a reopening of the inquest, arguing that the evidence against Sterry was never properly examined. 73 years, 3 suspects, and a daughter's accusation that was brushed aside because her father fixed locks for the police. But in the next case, a man spent 15 years in prison for a crime he almost certainly did not commit, and the real killer may have struck again just weeks later. Leanne Holland. On Monday, September 23, 1991, the first day of school holidays, a 12-year-old girl left her home at 78 Alice Street, Goodna, southwest of Brisbane, at approximately 9:30 a.m. to walk to a hairdresser. She was never seen alive again. Her body was found 3 days later in bushland on Red Bank Plains Road by police on trail bikes. She had suffered at least 10 blows to the head from a blunt instrument, burn marks on her lower body, and had been doused in accelerant and set alight. Her injuries were so severe that the body had to be identified via fingerprints. The man arrested for her death 5 days later would spend nearly 15 years in prison, and the evidence that put him there has since been dismantled piece by piece. Graham Stewart Stafford, 28, a sheet metal worker and live-in boyfriend of Leanne's older sister Melissa, was arrested on September 28, 1991. He was convicted of murder on March 25, 1992, at the Supreme Court of Queensland and sentenced to life imprisonment with a 15-year non-parole period. The case rested entirely on circumstantial evidence: small amounts of blood, a single hair, a maggot found in his car, and tire impressions that escalated from similar to identical between the initial police report and trial testimony. From the beginning, the case was plagued by problems that raised serious doubts. Crown Prosecutor Vishal Lakshman declined to prosecute, being unconvinced of Stafford's guilt. Another prosecutor took over. An undercover officer placed in Stafford's cell to extract a confession concluded he was not the killer. DNA expert Angela Van Dahl, who testified at trial, later stated the blood evidence was insufficient for conviction. The arresting officer, Detective Sergeant Graham Richards, was later exposed in a 2009 Crime and Misconduct Commission report for improperly releasing a convicted person from prison in a separate case. But the most troubling detail of all involves 2 alternative suspects who were never properly investigated. 3 weeks after Leanne's death, Sean Peter McPhedran, an 18-year-old schizophrenic from the nearby Gales Caravan Park who knew Leanne, killed another 12-year-old girl, Julianne Lowe, just 970 meters from the Holland home. He did this while Stafford was already in custody. Police refused to link the 2 cases. McPhedran remains in custody over 30 years later. Another suspect, Mark Thomas Noble, had a violent criminal history stretching across multiple states. His girlfriend reported that in 2001 or 2002, he confided he had killed a young girl in the western Brisbane suburbs near some beehives. Leanne's body was found less than 100 meters from beehives. Noble was later convicted of a separate killing in Tasmania involving an axe and died in 2017. Two viable suspects, both with histories that matched the profile of the crime, and neither was ever properly investigated. While Stafford sat in a cell for a crime the system's own people doubted he committed. How do you ignore a suspect who killed another girl of the same age, less than a kilometer away, 3 weeks later? While the man you arrested was already behind bars. After 3 appeals spanning 17 years, the Queensland Court of Appeal quashed Stafford's conviction on December 24, 2009, in a landmark 2-1 decision, finding a miscarriage of justice due to flawed forensics and non-disclosure of evidence that could have helped the defense. Justice Catherine Holmes dissented, but not because she believed Stafford was guilty. She argued he should have been acquitted outright rather than offered a retrial. On March 26, 2010, the DPP decided a retrial would not be in the public interest. Stafford was never formally acquitted, leaving him in permanent legal limbo. Not convicted, not cleared. He served nearly 15 years in prison and has received no compensation. There is no statutory right to compensation for wrongful conviction in Queensland, despite years of campaigning by the Who Killed Leanne Holland advocacy group. No coronial inquest has ever been held into her death. Her case remains officially unsolved. 15 years behind bars, a conviction overturned, and no apology, no compensation, and no inquest. But in the next case, the wait for justice was even longer, 43 years, and the man at the center of it may have taken over 30 lives. The McCulkin murders. On the night of January 16, 1974, a 34-year-old woman and her 2 daughters disappeared from their home at 6 Dorchester Street, Highgate Hill, Brisbane. Neighbors Janet and Janine Gayton saw 2 men known as Vince and Shorty at the house with a distinctive orange Valiant Charger. The family cats were locked inside. The beds had not been slept in. The lights were left on. Days later, Brisbane was swamped by the catastrophic 1974 floods, diverting police attention at the most critical stage of the investigation. The bodies of all 3 victims have never been found. It would take 43 years before anyone was held accountable. Barbara McCulkin, 34, and her daughters Vicky and Leanne were connected to one of Australia's worst mass casualty events. On March 8, 1973, the Whiskey O Go Go nightclub in Fortitude Valley was firebombed, killing 15 people. Barbara's estranged husband Billy had criminal connections that linked him to individuals involved in the bombings. Barbara herself was perceived as having knowledge of who was responsible. That knowledge made her a target. Vincent O'Dempsey, born circa 1939, was nicknamed the Angel of Death and the Night Dragon. He was one of the most feared figures in Australian criminal history. A man whose reputation alone kept potential witnesses from speaking for decades. His own father had him admitted to a mental institution at age 16. His ex-fiancée, Carrie Ann Scully, testified that O'Dempsey told her his kill count was 33. Criminal associates believed the true number exceeded 100. He boasted to people around him, "They'll never catch me because they'll never find the bodies." For 40 years, he was right. Gary Shorty Dubois, born 1947, had a prior conviction and served 8 years. 11 days before the Whiskey O Go Go firebombing, Dubois and others had firebombed the Torino nightclub on O'Dempsey's orders. He confessed details of what happened to the McCulkins to associate Peter Hall on approximately January 17, 1974, the day after the family vanished. Hall remained silent for 40 years before finally agreeing to testify. 4 decades of silence from a man who knew exactly what had happened. O'Dempsey's brother-in-law, Paul Dubois, testified that Gary told him, "Vince told me the kids weren't meant to be there," suggesting the plan was only to silence Barbara. But the daughter's presence that night changed everything. How does a witness stay silent for 40 years before finally deciding to speak? O'Dempsey and Dubois were first charged in April 1980, but charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. Cold case detectives reinvestigated the case over decades, and on October 18, 2014, over 40 years after the disappearance, both were charged again. Dubois was found guilty on November 28, 2016, of the manslaughter of Barbara and the harming and killing of both daughters. O'Dempsey was found guilty on May 26, 2017, of all 3 counts. On June 1, 2017, 43 years after Barbara and her daughters vanished from Dorchester Street, Justice Peter Applegarth sentenced both to life imprisonment without parole eligibility under the laws that applied in 1974. To O'Dempsey, he said, "You murdered a defenseless woman. You are a child killer. You are beyond redemption." Both appeals were dismissed in 2018. The conviction stood. Dubois died on June 7, 2021, aged 74, taking his own life in his cell at Maryborough Correctional Center. His death came just 1 week before he was scheduled to testify at a reopened inquest into the Whiskey Au Go-Go firebombing. Whatever additional information he carried about the nightclub attack, the identities of those who ordered it, and the full scope of what happened in January 1974, died with him in that cell. O'Dempsey, now approximately 86, remains imprisoned at Woolston Correctional Center. He testified at the Whiskey Au Go-Go inquest in May 2022, denying everything. He has never revealed where the McCulkin family's remains are buried and is expected to die behind bars without ever doing so. The Ghost Gate Road podcast and ongoing investigative journalism continue to explore the full extent of O'Dempsey's criminal history across decades. 43 years, a witness who stayed silent for 4 decades, and 3 bodies that have never been found. But in the next case, the evidence was not hidden. It was on the stovetop. Mayang Prasetyo. On October 3, 2014, a 27-year-old trained chef from Geelong, Victoria, killed his 27-year-old wife at their ground-floor apartment at 113 Commercial Road, Tenerife, Brisbane. What he did afterward, using the professional skills he had spent years developing, turned the apartment into a scene that responding officers initially thought was some kind of elaborate prank. It was not. Mayang Prasetyo, 27, was an Indonesian transgender woman who had married Marcus Peter Volke in Copenhagen on August 1, 2013. The marriage was described as partly a business arrangement, an Australian visa sponsorship, though there was evidence of a genuine, if volatile, relationship. Prasetyo was the chief breadwinner for her mother and 2 younger sisters back in Indonesia, sending money home regularly. Both Volke and Prasetyo led secret double lives as sex workers, unknown to their respective families. Volke's parents in rural Victoria believed he was a chef working on cruise ships. He advertised himself under a different name in Copenhagen. The 2 of them had built an entire life together that neither of their families truly understood. The fatal wound was a stab to the throat that severed the trachea and left common carotid artery, inflicted after a protracted argument heard by neighbors between 11:30 p.m. on October 2nd and 1:30 a.m. on October 3rd. What Volke did next drew on his professional training. He purchased a meat cleaver, rubber gloves, bleach, caustic soda, and a 36.5-liter stockpot. He dismembered Prasetyo's body and attempted to dissolve the remains using chemicals heated on the stovetop. The stockpot boiled over and short-circuited the apartment's power, forcing Volke to call an electrician. The electrician described the smell as pungent and putrid, a bit like dog food. Volke told him it was pig's broth. Building manager Debrina Hughes noticed blood throughout the unit and called police for a welfare check at approximately 9 p.m. on October 4th, one day after the killing. When officers told Volke they needed to enter the apartment, he asked to go in first to secure his dogs. He locked the door behind him, slashed his own throat and wrists with a knife, and fled through the back balcony into the darkness. Police entered with a master key and found a scene unlike anything they had encountered. Prasetyo's feet were protruding from the stockpot on the stove. Body parts were found in a garbage bag inside the washing machine. First responder Constable McWhinney initially thought it was some sort of sick prank. It was not. Police dog Zuma tracked Volke from the apartment through the building's corridors and down into an underground car park, where he was found inside an industrial waste bin with massive self-inflicted knife wounds. He was declared dead at 10:18 p.m. from an air embolism. The man who killed Mayang Prasetyo was dead before investigators could ask him a single question about why he did it. How does a man call an electrician to fix power that was short-circuited by a stockpot he was using to dissolve his wife, and then sit there while the tradesman works? The media coverage of this case sparked its own controversy. The Courier Mail ran the front-page headline, "Monster Chef and the She-Male," and described Prasetyo as a ladyboy, sparking nationwide outrage. A Change.org petition gathered nearly 28,000 signatures demanding an apology. The Australian Press Council ruled the coverage breached standards for fairness and was gratuitous. Several Brisbane cafes boycotted the newspaper. Marcus Volke never faced trial. State Coroner Terry Ryan delivered findings on May 19, 2017, ruling Volke killed Prasetyo and then himself. The case was classified as a domestic situation. No police officer caused or contributed to Volke's death. Prasetyo's mother in Indonesia expressed forgiveness toward Volke's family. A stockpot on the stove, an electrician who thought it smelled like dog food, and a killer who never faced a courtroom. But the final case on this list has been waiting for answers for 40 years, and the primary suspect died without ever being charged. Sharon Phillips. On the evening of May 8, 1986, a 20-year-old woman drove her friend Samantha Dalzell home to Red Bank Plains. While returning to her flat in Archerfield, her yellow Datsun Bluebird ran out of petrol on Ipswich Road at Wachall, near the Wachall Army Barracks. She walked into the barracks, but was told there were no telephones available. She then walked 1.5 kilometers to a public phone box on Wachall Station Road. At 11:18 p.m., she made a reverse charge call, asking someone to pick her up. After a brief conversation with a bystander at the phone box, she was never seen or heard from again. Sharon Phillips, 20, had called Martin Balaz, a man she had recently met, asking him to come get her. She made a second call between 12:03 and 12:08 a.m. Balaz drove to the wrong service station, suffered a flat tire along the way, and eventually went home, assuming she had found another way back. Her mother reported her missing at 8 p.m. on May 9th. Police found her white flat-heeled shoes and silver purse in a nearby drain on May 15th. There was no sign of Sharon herself. The primary suspect was Raymond Peter Mulvihill, a former Red Bank Plains taxi driver who drove for a taxi company based on Wackle Station Road, the very same street where Sharon made her last phone calls. The proximity was not a coincidence. Mulvihill knew that stretch of road intimately. He knew when it was quiet. He knew who would be there and who would not. Described as a dangerous and volatile man with a history of intimidation, his stepson called him a mass murderer who referred to himself as the gingerbread man, as if daring the world to catch him. Mulvihill died of cancer in 2002, never having been charged with anything related to Sharon's disappearance. In October 2017, 15 years after his death, Queensland Police officially stated that, on the available evidence, if Mr. Mulvihill were still alive, he would be arrested for the murder of Miss Phillips. The police named him publicly, but there was no one left to arrest. In March 2016, Mulvihill's stepson, Ian Seeley, contacted police, claiming he was present on the night Sharon disappeared. He said he helped his father place Sharon, alive, with blood on her head, into the boot of a car. He alleged a deathbed confession in 2002. You have to tell them about the girls. However, the state coroner found Seeley to be an unreliable witness with a commercial motive. He had co-produced the Evil Gingerbread Man podcast about the case and stood to benefit from the attention. In May 2016, police excavated concrete culverts at Carroll Park based on Seeley's directions. No remains were found. Would the stepson really come forward after 30 years to help solve the case? Or was he building a media brand around his own family's darkest secret? Former sister-in-law Allison Clancy provided previously unheard testimony at the 2021 inquest, claiming Mulvihill confessed at a 1992 family christening. Sharon Phillips, my 5 minutes of fame. However, the coroner noted her account may have been shaped by decades of media reports about the case. State Coroner Terry Ryan delivered findings on May 20th, 2024, concluding Sharon is deceased under suspicious circumstances, but that the evidence was insufficient to make a positive finding about Mulvihill's or Seeley's involvement. The coroner stated, "It is possible that both Mr. Mulvihill and Mr. Seeley had some involvement in Sharon's disappearance. Possible, but not proven. Not enough for charges. Not enough for answers. No one has ever been charged. Sharon's body has never been found. Both of her parents died without knowing who was responsible or where their daughter is. A $250,000 reward remains on offer." The case remains with the Queensland Police Service Cold Case Investigation Team. 40 years later, a phone box on Whitehall Station Road is the last place anyone saw Sharon Phillips alive. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.